The night Daniel Whitaker asked his wife to wait by the service corridor instead of the ballroom entrance was the moment something inside her quietly stopped hoping. He said it politely, almost gently, as if he were offering helpful advice instead of erasing her presence. "It's better if you stay near the back tonight," he told her while adjusting the cuffs of his expensive suit in the mirror of their hotel room. "Some important investors will be there. I just need everything to go smoothly." Clara Whitaker nodded the way she had learned to do during the 21 years of their marriage.
Calm, quiet.
Accepting. She did not argue because arguing had never led anywhere except to Daniel's cold disappointment, which always felt worse than anger. Disappointment meant she had failed him again, and Clara had spent 2 decades trying not to fail. Daniel Whitaker was a respected man in the Chicago business world. His name opened doors, secured contracts, and filled charity events with polite applause. People described him as disciplined, strategic, reliable. What they rarely noticed was how carefully he controlled every detail of his life, especially the woman who stood beside him. Clara had not always been someone who blended into the background. Once, long before the marble floors of their suburban home and the quiet rules of Daniel's life, she had been a teacher in a small town in Michigan. She had laughed easily then. She spoke quickly, passionately, about books and children and the strange beauty of ordinary days. But life had a way of reshaping people, and over the years Clara had learned that Daniel preferred a quieter version of her. That afternoon, when he announced the charity gala, Clara had been surprised. He rarely invited her to events like this. Usually he attended alone, claiming the evenings were long, complicated, and filled with conversations she would find boring. "This one matters," he said without looking away from his phone. "The new foundation director will be there." Clara simply asked, "Are you sure you want me there?" Daniel glanced up, his expression measuring her the way someone studies a fragile object they are unsure about displaying. "Just wear something simple. Nothing that draws attention." Those instructions were familiar. Clara had heard versions of them for years. Nothing too bright. Nothing too noticeable. Nothing that made people ask questions. So that afternoon she drove to a small boutique outside the city and found a dark green dress on a clearance rack. It was elegant but modest, the kind of dress that could exist comfortably in the background of any room. She stood in the fitting room for a long moment, studying her reflection. At 47, Clara still had the soft features that had once made strangers smile at her in grocery store lines. But the woman in the mirror looked tired in a way that makeup could not hide. There was a hesitancy in her eyes, as if she had spent too many years asking silent permission before speaking. Still, the dress fit well. It would not embarrass Daniel. The ballroom of the Grand Lakeshore Hotel glowed with chandeliers and quiet luxury that evening. Waiters moved like shadows between tables covered in white linen. Conversations floated through the air in carefully controlled laughter. Wealthy donors and business leaders filled the room, dressed in fabrics that shimmered under the light. Daniel stepped into that world effortlessly. The moment they arrived, his posture changed. His smile sharpened, his voice grew confident, and his attention moved quickly toward the people he wanted to impress. Clara followed him for only a few steps before he leaned closer and murmured quietly, "Just wait near the corridor. I'll come get you when introductions start." She watched him disappear into the crowd. The corridor where he left her was near a tall window overlooking the city. From there she could see the skyline glowing against the dark water of Lake Michigan. Music drifted faintly from the ballroom while laughter rose and fell like waves. Clara stood there holding a glass of sparkling water she had no intention of drinking. From a distance, she watched Daniel become the man the world admired. He shook hands, leaned in close during conversations, laughed loudly at jokes that were not especially funny. Every movement seemed calculated, as if he were performing a role that required constant precision. For years, Clara had told herself that this was simply how successful people behaved. But something about standing alone by that window made the performance feel suddenly obvious. Then the atmosphere inside the ballroom shifted. It was subtle at first. Conversations paused for a fraction of a second. Heads turned. The music seemed to fade beneath a ripple of curiosity spreading through the room. Someone important had arrived. Clara glanced toward the entrance. A tall man stepped into the ballroom with a kind of calm confidence that did not need attention to prove its presence. He moved slowly, greeting people with quiet nods instead of dramatic gestures. Yet wherever he walked, people instinctively made space. This was not the loud influence of someone trying to impress a room. This was the quiet gravity of someone who already owned it. Daniel noticed him immediately. Across the room, Clara saw her husband straighten his shoulders and adjust his jacket. His eyes sharpened with ambition as he moved quickly through the crowd. Daniel extended his hand toward the newcomer with polished enthusiasm. "Mr. Adrian Cole," Daniel said loudly enough for several nearby guests to hear. "It's an honor to finally meet you." Adrian Cole was known across several states as the quiet architect behind one of the fastest-growing investment groups in the Midwest. Newspapers described him as strategic, brilliant, and intensely private. Few people truly knew him. Adrian shook Daniel's hand politely, but his attention drifted almost instantly. His eyes moved across the ballroom slowly, thoughtfully, as if searching for something he was not entirely sure he would find. Then he saw her. Clara felt the moment before she understood it. His gaze locked onto the woman standing alone by the window. For a heartbeat, the calm composure on Adrian's face disappeared. Shock replaced it. The kind of shock that comes from recognizing something long believed lost. Daniel continued speaking, still describing himself and his company. But Adrian was no longer listening. His hand slipped free from the handshake mid-sentence. Without apology, he stepped away. Daniel blinked in confusion as Adrian walked past him, straight toward the corridor, straight toward Clara. Guests noticed the movement and slowly fell silent, curiosity spreading through the room. A path opened naturally as Adrian crossed the floor. Clara's pulse began to race. She knew that face. Not the man he had become, but the boy he once was. 25 years earlier, in a small lakeside town in northern Michigan, Clara Bennett had fallen in love with a quiet college student named Adrian Cole. They had planned a life together, until she disappeared without explanation. Adrian stopped a few feet in front of her. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, as if confirming that memory had not tricked him. Then he said her name, Clara. His voice carried the quiet weight of years. Clara's hands trembled slightly at her sides. "Adrian," she whispered. Behind them, Daniel Whitaker finally reached the corridor, confusion quickly turning into irritation as he realized what was happening. Adrian did not look away from Clara. "I looked for you," he said softly. The words landed in the silence, like something fragile breaking open. Daniel stepped forward sharply. "Mr. Cole," he said with forced politeness, "I think there's been some misunderstanding. This is my wife." Adrian finally turned toward him. There was nothing hostile in his expression, only certainty. "I know exactly who she is," he said calmly. Then he looked back at Clara. And the past, long buried beneath years of silence, began quietly returning to life. When Adrian Cole spoke Clara's name in the quiet corridor of the ballroom, the past did not simply return. It unsettled everything that had been carefully arranged for more than 20 years. For a moment, the noise of the charity gala faded into the background. Guests nearby pretended not to stare, but their curiosity lingered in the air like a held breath. Daniel Whitaker stood rigid beside them, his polite smile fixed in place, though the tension in his jaw betrayed the irritation building underneath. Clara could feel Daniel's presence without looking at him. She knew that expression well. It was the same look he wore whenever something in his perfectly organized world moved outside his control. Adrian, however, seemed completely unaware of the tension radiating from Daniel. His attention remained on Clara, studying her face, as if trying to reconcile the woman standing before him with the memory he had carried for decades. Time had added years to both of them, but recognition had not faded. "I never thought I would see you again," Adrian said quietly. Clara struggled to steady her breathing. "Neither did I." Daniel cleared his throat, a deliberate interruption. "Mr. Cole," he said firmly, "I'm sure you didn't realize. My wife and I should return to the ballroom." Adrian finally looked at him, though his gaze was calm rather than confrontational. "Of course," he replied, "but I would like to speak with Clara sometime, if she's willing." Daniel's hand appeared instantly on Clara's arm. His grip was subtle enough that others might not notice, but she felt the pressure immediately. "I'm afraid that won't be necessary," Daniel said smoothly. Clara spoke before she could stop herself. "It's all right." Daniel's fingers tightened slightly, a silent warning. But Adrian had already reached into his jacket and removed a small card. "If you ever want to talk," he said gently, placing it in Clara's hand, "I'll answer." Their fingers touched only briefly, yet the moment carried an unexpected familiarity. It reminded Clara of something she had not allowed herself to remember in years, the way Adrian had always treated her as if her thoughts mattered. Daniel did not wait for another word. He turned sharply and guided Clara back toward the ballroom, his hand still firm around her arm. They left the event shortly afterward. The car ride home was silent. Chicago's city lights blurred past the windows while Daniel focused on the road with the intense concentration of a man replaying a problem in his mind. Clara kept her hands folded in her lap, the small business card hidden carefully between her fingers. She already knew what the silence meant. Daniel was thinking. He always thought before speaking when something threatened his control. The moment they stepped inside their large, quiet house in the suburbs, Daniel removed his coat and hung it neatly in the hallway. His movements were slow and deliberate, almost calm. Clara stood near the doorway, waiting. Finally, Daniel turned toward her. "Well," he said lightly, "that was unexpected."
Clara said nothing.
Daniel walked into the kitchen and poured himself a drink. The sound of ice clinking against glass echoed through the quiet room. "That man," Daniel continued, leaning casually against the counter. "Adrian Cole. He seemed very interested in you." Clara kept her voice steady. "We knew each other a long time ago." Daniel studied her for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I know." The words caught her off guard. "You know?" Daniel took a slow sip from his glass. "I've known about Adrian Cole for years." The statement landed heavily between them. Clara blinked. "What do you mean?" Daniel set the glass down carefully, as if placing a piece on a chessboard. "Before we married," he said calmly, "I made a point of learning about your past." Clara felt an uneasy chill creep through her chest. "That's normal," she said slowly. "People ask questions." Daniel shook his head slightly. "I didn't just ask questions." He paused, watching her reaction. "I monitored them." The room seemed suddenly colder. Clara frowned. "I don't understand." Daniel smiled faintly, though the expression lacked warmth. "You disappeared from Adrian Cole's life very suddenly," he explained. "For a man like him, that kind of mystery doesn't fade easily." Clara's heartbeat quickened. "He tried to find you." Her stomach tightened. Daniel continued in the same calm tone. "Private investigators, old classmates, former professors, even your hometown." Clara felt as though the floor beneath her had shifted. "He looked for me?" "For years," Daniel said. The information hit her like a wave of disbelief. She had convinced herself long ago that Adrian had simply moved on, that their story had ended the moment she walked away. But Daniel was still speaking. He came close several times, he added. Clara stared at him. What do you mean close? Daniel lifted his glass again. I mean that each time he followed a lead, the information was outdated. Her breath caught. Addresses changed. Phone numbers disconnected. People who remembered very little. A slow, terrible realization began to form. Daniel watched her carefully. You see, he said quietly, I made sure he never found you. The words felt unreal. You what? Daniel shrugged slightly. I protected our marriage. Clara felt the room spin. You stopped him? Daniel did not deny it. Information is surprisingly easy to influence if you know the right people. Clara's voice trembled. For how long? Daniel answered without hesitation. Since the beginning. The truth settled heavily into the silence. All those years. All those unanswered questions. All the quiet nights when Clara had wondered whether Adrian had ever tried to look for her. Daniel had known. And he had made sure the search failed. Clara felt something deep inside her begin to crack. You let him believe I disappeared, she whispered. Daniel's expression hardened slightly. You chose to disappear. That's not the same thing, she said, her voice shaking. Daniel sighed, as if explaining something obvious. If Adrian Cole had found you back then, he said, you never would have married me.
Clara could not argue with that.
The truth of it hung in the air between them. Daniel continued. I simply ensured that the past stayed where it belonged. In the dark, Clara said quietly. Daniel did not respond. For the first time in many years, Clara looked at her husband and saw him clearly, not as the stable man who had offered safety when her life felt broken, but as someone who had quietly shaped her world without her knowing. The realization was slow, but irreversible. Daniel had not simply married her. He had managed her life. And the silence she had lived inside for 2 decades suddenly felt less like peace and more like a carefully constructed cage. Clara closed her hand around the business card still hidden in her palm. Adrian's name pressed faintly against her skin. A door she believed had closed forever had quietly reopened. And for the first time in 21 years, Clara began to wonder what her life might have looked like if someone had never locked that door in the first place. Clara did not sleep that night. Long after Daniel had retreated to his study and closed the door behind him, the house remained silent except for the faint ticking of the clock above the fireplace. The sound seemed louder than usual, each second marking the slow collapse of a life she had believed was stable. She sat alone in the dim light of the living room, Adrian's card resting on the table in front of her. For 21 years, Clara had believed the past was gone. Not lost exactly, but sealed away somewhere unreachable. She had convinced herself that Adrian had eventually forgotten her, that the pain she caused him had simply faded with time. It had been easier to believe that than to imagine he might have searched. But now the truth had shifted everything. He had looked for her, and Daniel had made sure he failed. Clara replayed the conversation again and again in her mind. Every detail felt sharper now, as if her memories were rearranging themselves into a new pattern. The quiet rules of her marriage suddenly made more sense. The way Daniel discouraged her from reconnecting with people from her past, the subtle ways he managed information about her life. At the time, she had accepted those things as part of compromise. Marriage required adjustment, Daniel always said. But compromise should never feel like disappearance. Clara stared at the small white card on the table. Adrian Cole, a phone number beneath his name. She wondered how many years had passed since the last time she had spoken his name out loud. More than 2 decades. The thought felt unreal. When she finally picked up the card, her fingers trembled slightly. Calling him would mean opening a door that had remained closed for half her life. It would mean confronting the version of herself she had abandoned. For a long moment, she simply sat there, listening to the quiet house. Then she stood and walked into the kitchen. Her phone rested on the counter. Clara stared at the number again before slowly dialing. The call connected almost immediately. Hello. His voice sounded older than she remembered, deeper and steadier, but unmistakably the same. Clara hesitated. Adrian. There was a pause on the other end. Clara. The way he said her name made her chest tighten. I wasn't sure you would call, he admitted. I wasn't sure either, she replied softly. Silence settled between them, though it felt different from the silence she lived with in her marriage. This silence was careful, almost respectful. Finally, Adrian spoke. Are you all right? The simple question nearly broke her composure. No one had asked her that in years. I don't know, Clara admitted. Adrian didn't interrupt. She took a slow breath. Daniel told me something tonight. What did he say? Clara hesitated before answering. He said you try to find me. Adrian exhaled slowly. Yes. For how long? There was another pause. Longer than I should have, Adrian said quietly. Clara closed her eyes. I thought you moved on. I tried, he replied honestly, but I never understood why you left. The words carried no accusation, only confusion that had clearly survived the years. Clara felt a wave of guilt rise inside her. I should have told you the truth back then, she said. You don't have to explain if you don't want to, Adrian replied. I do, she said softly. Just not over the phone. Adrian seemed to understand immediately. Then we'll talk in person, he said. Where would you feel comfortable? Clara thought for a moment. Somewhere quiet. I know a place, Adrian said. Tomorrow afternoon. The next day, Clara drove farther from the city than she had planned. The cafe Adrian suggested sat beside a small lake about an hour outside Chicago. It was the kind of place Daniel would never visit. Simple wooden tables, quiet music, sunlight reflecting across the water. When Clara arrived, Adrian was already there. He stood as she approached, though neither of them moved to hug. The distance between them felt appropriate, respectful of the years that had passed. Yet the familiarity remained. They sat near the window, overlooking the lake. For a few minutes they talked about small things, the drive, the weather, the quiet beauty of the area. It felt strangely normal, as if the decades between them had compressed into something manageable. Eventually, Adrian leaned back in his chair. Daniel said I looked for you, he said. Clara nodded. He also told me he made sure you couldn't find me. Adrian's expression tightened. I suspected something like that. Clara looked surprised. You did. Adrian nodded slowly. Some of the leads I followed didn't make sense, he explained. Information would appear and then disappear. Addresses that should have been accurate turned out to be wrong. Clara felt a chill. Daniel told me he paid people to redirect the search. Adrian absorbed the information quietly. That explains a lot. Clara looked down at her hands. I thought leaving you was the only way to protect you. Adrian frowned slightly. Protect me from what? Clara took a deep breath. Your family. Adrian's eyebrows lifted in surprise. My family? They threatened everything, Clara said. My scholarship. My future. Even your career. Adrian stared at her. They met with you? Yes. When? The week after we got engaged. Adrian leaned forward slowly. I didn't know about that. Clara nodded. I never told you. The silence that followed carried years of misunderstanding. Adrian finally spoke. They never mentioned it to me. Clara felt a bitter smile form. I'm not surprised. What did they say to you? Adrian asked. Clara hesitated. They said people like me would only damage your future. Adrian shook his head in disbelief. That doesn't sound like them. Clara looked up. You didn't see that side of them. Adrian studied her carefully. What made you believe them? Clara's voice grew quieter. Because 3 days later my scholarship funding was suddenly under review. Adrian's expression darkened. And I was pregnant. The words landed heavily between them. Adrian froze. You what? Clara nodded slowly. I lost the baby a few weeks later. The lake outside shimmered quietly under the afternoon sun, completely unaware of the history being uncovered inside the cafe. Adrian leaned back in his chair, stunned. You never told me. I couldn't, Clara whispered. Why not? Because I thought your life would be destroyed if you stayed with me. Adrian ran a hand through his hair, struggling to process the information. For 25 years, I thought you simply changed your mind, he said. Clara's eyes filled with quiet sadness. I thought disappearing would protect you. Adrian looked at her with a mixture of regret and disbelief. And Daniel knew all of this? Clara nodded. He knew enough. Adrian's expression hardened. And he still kept us apart. Yes. The truth sat heavily between them. Outside, the lake remained calm, the sunlight steady. But inside that quiet cafe, decades of silence were finally beginning to unravel. And for the first time since Clara walked away all those years ago, both of them were finally seeing the full story of what had really happened. The conversation at the lakeside cafe did not end quickly. In fact, neither Clara nor Adrian seemed eager to leave, as if both of them understood that the truth unfolding between them had been waiting more than 20 years to be spoken aloud. Outside, the water moved slowly beneath the afternoon sun, calm and steady, while inside the cafe, two people carefully pieced together a history that had once been torn apart by fear, silence, and decisions made too quickly. Adrian sat quietly for a long time after Clara finished explaining what had happened all those years ago. The meeting with his family, the threats, the pregnancy she had been too afraid to reveal, and the loss she had carried alone. None of it sounded dramatic when she said it out loud, yet every sentence held the weight of choices that had changed both of their lives. Finally, Adrian spoke. You should never have had to face that alone, he said. Clara gave a small, tired smile. At the time it felt like the only option. Adrian leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful rather than emotional. You thought leaving would protect me, he said. Yes. And then you married Daniel. Clara nodded. I thought stability would make the pain easier. Adrian didn't argue with that logic. Life often pushed people toward choices that looked safe from the outside, even when those choices slowly erased who they were. What are you going to do now? Adrian asked gently. Clara looked out the window at the quiet lake. I don't know yet, she admitted. But the truth was that something inside her had already begun to shift. Daniel's confession the night before had broken something fundamental in the structure of her marriage. The trust she once believed existed between them had been revealed as control disguised as protection. And once that realization took hold, it became impossible to ignore. When Clara returned home later that evening, Daniel was waiting. He stood in the living room near the fireplace, his posture rigid and his expression controlled. The moment she walked through the door, his eyes moved immediately to her face, studying her carefully. You went to see him, he said. It was not a question. Yes, Clara replied calmly. Daniel nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had expected. And how was the reunion? Clara removed her coat and placed it over the back of a chair before answering.
Honest.
Daniel let out a quiet breath. Honesty can be dangerous, he said. Clara met his gaze. So can lies. The room fell silent for a moment. Daniel stepped closer. You're upset right now, he said, his voice controlled but firm. That's understandable. Old memories have a way of confusing people. Clara shook her head. I'm not confused. Daniel's expression tightened slightly. You're letting the past distort the present. No, Clara said quietly. I'm finally seeing the present clearly. Daniel's patience began to thin. I built a life for us, he said. A good life. Clara looked around the large, quiet house, the polished floors, the carefully arranged furniture, the expensive art that filled the walls. "Yes," she said, but her voice carried a new certainty. "You built a life where I disappeared." Daniel's jaw hardened. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" Clara asked. Daniel crossed his arms. "You were safe here." Clara shook her head slowly. "I was controlled." Daniel took a step closer, frustration rising beneath his calm exterior. "I protected what we had." "You protected your version of it," Clara replied. For the first time that evening, Daniel's voice sharpened. "If Adrian Cole had found you years ago, you would have left." Clara didn't deny it. "Yes." The honesty of the answer seemed to surprise him. Daniel stared at her. "And now?" he asked. Clara took a slow breath. "Now I'm leaving anyway." The words settled heavily into the room. Daniel blinked, as if he had misheard. "You're being irrational." "No," Clara said calmly. "I'm being honest. You're throwing away 21 years. Clara's voice remained steady. "I lost those years a long time ago." Daniel studied her face carefully, searching for hesitation. But the uncertainty he had relied on for 2 decades was gone. "You think Adrian is going to save you?" he asked bitterly. Clara shook her head. "This isn't about him." "Then what is it about?" Clara answered, without hesitation. "Myself." Daniel laughed quietly, though there was no humor in the sound. "You won't last 6 months on your own." Clara didn't react. "You've been dependent on me for half your life," he continued. "Everything you have exists because of me." Clara listened carefully. Then she spoke with calm clarity. "Everything I lost also exists because of you." Daniel's expression darkened. "You'll regret this." "Maybe," Clara said, "but staying would be worse." Daniel said nothing else as she walked past him and went upstairs. That night, Clara packed a single suitcase. She didn't rush. There was no anger in her movements, no dramatic confrontation. Instead, there was a quiet certainty guiding each decision. Clothes, a few books, personal documents, the essentials of a new beginning. By morning, she was gone. The first weeks after leaving Daniel were not easy. Independence, Clara discovered, required rebuilding parts of herself that had been neglected for years. She had to relearn how to make decisions without asking permission, how to trust her instincts, how to move through the world without the constant weight of someone else's expectations. Adrian kept his distance during that time. He offered support when she asked for it, legal advice, professional connections, practical guidance, but he never pushed her toward any particular choice. That restraint mattered more than any grand gesture. Clara found work again within a few months, returning to education through a community learning program that supported adult students finishing their degrees. The work was challenging, meaningful, and entirely her own. Slowly, the quiet confidence she once had began to return. She spoke more freely. She laughed more easily. Most importantly, she no longer felt invisible. Her divorce from Daniel moved forward steadily. Without Clara's silence protecting his image, the carefully controlled life he had built began to unravel in ways he hadn't anticipated. Financial investigations uncovered questionable business practices, and the reputation he had guarded so fiercely started to collapse under scrutiny. Clara watched the news reports from the small apartment she now rented near the lake. But she felt no satisfaction, only distance, because Daniel's downfall was no longer the center of her story. Her future was. Nearly a year after that night at the charity gala, Clara and Adrian walked together along the same lakeside path where they had first spoken honestly about the past. The evening air was warm, and the sky glowed softly with the colors of sunset. Adrian stopped walking and looked at her. "Whatever happens next," he said, "I want it to be your decision." Clara smiled. "That's the first time anyone has ever said that to me. Adrian returned the smile. And Clara looked out across the water. For the first time in decades, her life felt open rather than confined. I think, she said slowly, I'm finally ready to choose my own future. Adrian nodded. No pressure.
No expectation.
Just the quiet understanding of two people who had learned, through years of loss and silence, that real love never asks someone to disappear. And as the sun slipped below the horizon, Clara realized something she had once believed was impossible. Starting over was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of the life she had finally chosen.